So anyway, my daughter, who is now 21, a few years ago, she and I, we walk here at Bolsa Chica a lot, and she likes photographing birds as well. And what happened with this, with the penguins, is my daughter, I'm a writer, write books and about history and travel, and I'm a journalist. And my daughter writes a lot as well. She still does, she's in Chapman now, junior, but she writes a lot. And back then, when she was going to St. Bonaventure, there was a thing called Time for Kids. Time for Kids, I don't know if it's still in the schools. It was Time Magazine's kind of student publication. And she loved it. And she used to say, it's written by student reporters. So one day she saw how you could become a student reporter, and she entered, it was like a contest almost, and she goes through this whole process. It's like a 4 or 5 step thing, and she ends up getting picked as one of 12 students to be one of the student writers. As this goes on, she noticed an opportunity to write an essay contest where the winner, they chose her to go with me. And that's how, I mean, I'm a travel writer as well, and I've done a fair amount of travel, but not a trip like this. So in the fall of that year, my daughter and I were sent off to Antarctica. I'm going to show you very quickly just how this whole thing worked. Okay, so where we went, if you look here, this is basically where we are right now in the United States. And we were to fly, the way you get to Antarctica, there's really only one way. You can't fly there, you've got to take a ship there. And the ships all leave all the way down here at the very bottom of South America. You don't fly direct. I think we flew to Atlanta and then came down. We stopped in Buenos Aires and Chile and then came down here. And where you land is a little tiny place called, oops. But I meant to point out where we were traveling was a place called Snow Hill Island. This is all Antarctica down here, but this is where we were going to go. They had discovered that what they believed was the largest colony of emperor penguins on Earth, but nobody had ever been to see them there before. This was going to be, I think, the second ship to go visit these penguins. If you know what emperor penguins are, those are the really big penguins that are like, 4.5 feet tall. That's what we were going to go see. So, and by the way, I want to mention too, the fact that this was held on Earth Day, I think is sort of a nice, we'll talk about that afterwards, but anyhow, Earth Day is a day where I like to remember nature, of course, in these things. But anyway, this is where we were headed. So we had to start from here. And the one thing is, when you go to Antarctica, and they tell you this, it's not for everybody because of one thing. And that one thing is this thing called the Drake Passage. If you don't know what the Drake Passage is, the Drake Passage is the angriest ocean on Earth. It's basically, the Drake Passage is where 7 or 8 different seas kind of converge. So when you go through there, it's like no other passage. It's essentially 2 days of abject horror, you know what I mean? Literally where you're looking down and then you're looking back. And you're looking down and back, non-stop for about 2.5 days. It's so bad. When you get in your cabin, you look at your bed and there are 3 safety belts across it. And you say, well, what are those for? And they tell you that if you don't put those on, you'll hit the ceiling. That's how bad it is. And it's crazy. But anyhow, so we fly down to Ushuaia. It is the southernmost city on Earth. And behind us, what you see back there, that is our ship. It doesn't look like it, but that is a thing called a Russian icebreaker, the Klepnikov. Now, icebreakers are great for going to Antarctica because they can break ice, obviously. And where we were going to Snow Hill Island, there was a lot of ice. The problem with icebreakers is they don't have a lot of stabilization. So when you go through something like Drake Passage, you feel everything. They're not made for that. They're made for busting ice. So it's the worst possible kind of ship to go through the Drake Passage. And again, they tell you all this up front, and they tell you if you don't like getting seasick or feeling that way, prepare yourself, because the Drake Passages, and they're, it can be, obviously it's rougher at certain times, so there's no way to predict how bad it's going to be. But when you leave Ushuaia, you know that literally within about an hour or 2, you're going to be in it. And so if anyone's ever been on a cruise, it's usually very celebratory before you leave, and there's balloons and champagne. When you leave from Ushuaia, the mood is very serious. Everyone's kind of hunkered down, and they're like, lots of crosses being made and silent prayers. I mean, it's really intense. So we get in there, and I will tell you, within about an hour, things start to move, right? And I'm thinking, well, this isn't that bad. I mean, I like the ocean. I don't tend to get motion sick, but then it starts getting more severe. And then it starts getting, and then we have to strap in. Because if you were standing, my daughter and I, our thing was we didn't worry about getting sick necessarily. We worried about getting hurt. Because if you weren't careful, you could break your neck. If you had to go, say, in your cabin, this little bathroom, if you wanted to brush your teeth, you had to time it as such where you'd be like running uphill and then going straight down. And as you go by, you grab onto the door. That was what it was. When my daughter was hungry, I would have to go down not one, but 2 spiral staircases to get to where the food was. And there's only about 40 people on this ship. It's mostly scientists. So it was a very kind of rugged, more of a scientific expedition than like, it wasn't a pleasure cruise. And a Russian icebreaker is as no frills as it gets. So it's a fairly rough trip. But again, it's a sense of adventure, and there was something about it that we really liked, we really enjoyed. Anyhow, this is us setting off the Klebnikov. Now what happens is, okay, so we go, after the first night of the Drake Passage, it's like, okay, we survived night 1. Once you get through the night, you figure we can do one more night. But on night 2, something really strange happened. It was as bad as it had been the night before, but then, in the middle of all this, and my daughter and I figured out, if we looked at each other and were engaged in really intense conversation, it kept our minds like off the, like at one point I said to her, I had a jacket that was on a hook, and the jacket at one point was like sideways. And I said, you become so disoriented. I said, what are we doing now that my jacket is, it's like being in space, you know? So on this particular night, on night 2, it's as bad as it was, but then something weird happens. Then we start to feel almost like the ship was spinning. And things were creaking and moaning, and Claire says, Dad, what is it? I said, I don't know. Over the speaker, our leader comes over, and he says, look, I know what you're feeling. I know it's really weird. It's very different. He goes, we're in the middle of a storm that's so bad, the captain is trying to pull out of it and find, so just hunker down, hold on. It's going to be bad for the next 30 minutes, but we're safe, you know, he says, but we're going to have to turn out of this. And so the next 30 minutes was just, it was hellish. I mean, it was really crazy, you know? And that's when I thought, when you look on a map at where you are, there was a little map, a little globe in our room, and that's when you think, what are we doing down here? Maybe this place is just not supposed to go, right? But then what I had been doing was a wonderful, if you remember Admiral Shackleton, I brought his diaries with me. His ship had been stranded in Antarctica back in the 1920s. I was reading what those guys went through, and it's sort of, you know, it put things in a bit of perspective. What's amazing is once you get through the Drake Passage, within like a minute, it becomes, you hit the Weddell Sea, it becomes perfectly still, perfectly. And then you go outside and you start seeing these icebergs. And you start seeing these, I'm getting goosebumps looking at them because they were so majestic. And as you go past them, you know, each one was like a work of art, and we get close to them. And on this ship, there were so many scientists. We would get classes every day on what kinds of ice it were, what kinds of icebergs, how the ice formed. It was really interesting. You would see these almost cities of ice just crumble. You'd hear a roar off in the sea, and you would see these things, these glaciers come down and crash. It was really, really exhilarating. And then we brought a Flat Stanley with us. We brought a couple actually, because we figure how many Flat Stanleys would be able to go like to Antarctica. So we brought that guy and several other ones out a number of times. But what's really amazing is you would see sheets of ice as you were going through. And again, the icebreakers breaking through. It's a really dramatic process. And that's what, if you go on the front of the ship, you would see all of this ice. The ship's front would go up and then smash down, and bit by bit break through the ice. When the ice was at, we would end up going through all of that eventually to get to Snow Hill Island, which is really a fascinating process. But this is what you start to see out there. You'd notice what looked like little flecks of pepper on a piece of ice, and you know what those are, right? Those are penguins. You would start to see them off in the Weddell Sea, and that was really exciting. Because, again, our experience was going to be such where our plan was we were going to park in the ice eventually, then they were going to build 2 helicopters on the main deck. Any guess why they had to build the helicopters? If you had a guess?
How?
Why?
Oh, why?
Why were they in pieces?
So you don't have to go back to the Drake Passage, you can fly out.
They couldn't survive the Drake Passage built, so they bring them out as kits and they build them when you get there. There'd be no way to secure it. So you land on the ice, this was this was our landing point. This is like walking on the moon. When they tell you can finally go down and set foot on the ice, you come down the ladder, and that's my daughter's first steps on Antarctica. And that's the Klebnikov. Now, another thing, when we went through the Drake Passage, our cabin was up here. All right, yeah. So in terms of what you felt, I mean, we felt everything. And so that's clear down there. And once you park, it's really pretty amazing because this is when you feel like you've really arrived someplace, and they begin to start teaching you about penguins. But we were up in our room, and I looked down on the deck, and they're building helicopters, and I'm watching this. There's a blue one and a red one, and it's like, how safe? You know what I mean? Like one of them, I thought I noticed them not putting a part on one, and I'm like, all right, we're taking the blue one. But what happens? Blue. Don't let them put you in the red one, because you're out there, and what the plan is, it's a pretty exciting plan for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, every single day, you're going to get in a helicopter. They're going to fly you about 25 miles over the ice. They're going to land at a base camp, and you're going to spend the day finding the largest colony of emperor penguins, about 30,000 of them. And then you're going to go back to the helicopter, and you're on your own. Then you go back to the helicopter, end of day, you fly back the 25 or so miles to the ship, and the next day it starts all over again. So each day is a pretty rugged adventure. And you don't have to go if you don't want, but you're there, And after the first few days, there's a rhythm to it. And so we were really excited. And that's what the helicopters look like taking off as you're waiting to go. And again, it goes off about 25 miles. Now, what they do before you go out there, they teach you what they call penguin etiquette. And what penguin etiquette is they tell you, look, for one thing, most of these penguins have never seen people before. They're not going to know what you are. So they probably won't be scared of you. They're not going to think you're a predator if you don't act like a predator. But here's the deal. What they really stress is that you can't be aggressive toward a penguin. What the goal is when you get there is to go find a place on the ice when you see them and just sort of sit down quietly, not make a move, and let them discover you. And we were told they may come over to you. They may peck at you. They can touch you, but you can't touch them. They said to me, well, you, meaning me, they said, you have a pretty low deep voice. They tend to like deep voices. So if they come close to you and you talk with them, you might find that they're going to engage with you, or they might vocalize and things. So they tell you all about how to behave and what it's going to be like on the ice. But now you just want to get to them because you're there about 2 days getting acclimated, and it's so exciting to think about the emperors. And so what happens is on day one, you fly to the base camp, and they say, look, it's about a 1 to 2 mile hike over the ice to where the main colony is. And they've set up kind of they directionally just kind of say it's that way. There's a couple little flags up so you don't get lost, but they want people to go not together, but like in pairs, so you're sort of alone. So my daughter and I went, and at a certain point, you feel like you're on your own planet. Do you know what the population of Antarctica is? It's 0. Not one person lives on Antarctica. So when you're walking out there, before you get to the penguins, you stand there and you're like on an ice planet unto yourself. It really is a very remarkable, and when you think about on a globe where you are and how far from home you are, it's a really cool feeling. So anyhow, my daughter and I set off, and on the walk you'll see like wet-elf seals sleeping, which is really nice. But then we started to see some things, little black dots off on the ice mountains in front of us, like that. And you ever see a penguin what's called tobogganing when they slide on their belly? Well, that's what they were doing. And as we noticed, I said, let's just stand still and see what happens. So Claire and I are standing there, and we notice they start kind of directing themselves in this big U toward us. And they start tobogganing, and I'm quietly taking pictures, right? And they're tobogganing toward us. And we're like, this is so cool. This is like day one, and you can't believe this is happening. Then what happens on this very first day, 2 of them, I swear this is true, 2 of them come, and these 2 are like on a beeline right toward us. And I said to them jokingly, I said, which way is it to the main colony? And on cue, they both like pointed. I mean, seriously. And my daughter's like, no way. There is no way this is happening. And at that moment, that's when we realized that these are smart. I mean, look, I know they weren't pointing. I know it was some sort of involuntary reaction, but they were reacting to us. They came and found us. And I said, thank you very much. And then they got on their bellies and then tobogganed off. And it's like, it's almost like when Dorothy goes to Oz, you know, and sees like the first munchkins. It's like you can't believe these creatures exist. So we loved this. And so the goal is we're going to walk out around, there's a ridge here. The penguins are out here. And from this point, you start to hear this kind of weird sound happening far off in the distance. So we continue walking. Actually, it was, well, anyway. And when we finally arrived, this is what you're first greeted with when you turn the corner of this piece of glacier. And what's really crazy about this is now, when you see, now I want to explain something quickly. Penguins mate in April, typically April, May, and then she lays eggs. The father takes care of the eggs for a couple of months. She goes off and eats as much food as she can for a month or two so she can get really full and she wouldn't have to move a lot. She's all full of food. She comes back in the summertime. The father gives her the eggs. Then he goes off and does the same thing. And by our autumn, the chicks are hatching. That's when we went. We went in October. So what you're going to see in a lot of these pictures, you can see little gray chicks, right? And the adults. But what you'll notice is, see them back there? This continues beyond these ridges. So the more you walk, you just see this kind of scene over and over again. It's an incredible colony. I mean, really, they just went on in some cases as far as the eye could see. So when you first get there, you're taking this in. And at this point, there's about 20 of us walking around there. And the area is so vast. It's sort of like when you're swimming and you drift. You look over and it's like, all of a sudden they're 50 yards away. Then they're 100 yards away. Then you're alone with these penguins, my daughter and I. And that was really the key, to find places where you wouldn't have to sort of, not fight for attention, but you could have your own little privacy. So this is what greets you when you get there. And like I said, you can see it's a pretty special thing. And as you sit there were so many chicks. This was just the peak of hatching season. So we would sit down, and the chicks are even more curious than the adults. And they would march right over to you, and you'd sit there, and the chicks would come over. And I mean, again, it was precious on top of precious. You would see that, what I loved watching, we learned about penguin behavior and how basically it's mimicry. The chicks copy what the adults do. So the adults would be showing the chicks how to toboggan, and as you can see, the chicks begin to do it. Now, I'm literally sitting as far away as you are right here, taking these pictures. This is after a number of hours where they didn't mind me sitting there, everything was fine. But when you see the chicks begin to toboggan, you start to see their little cycle of life beginning, and it's really incredible to watch that teaching happen so quickly. I mean, again, the chicks you can photograph all day. As we would go back day after day, I became just riveted by these things. There was something, nature can be really brutal too. And we would see something really sad at night, whereas we would leave like late in the day as the sun was going down. It wasn't that cold during the day. It was probably in the high teens, but by nightfall it would get really cold. But as the sun would go down, you would see all the penguins begin to sort of huddle in a giant circle for warmth. That's what they would do. But you would see certain chicks that would try and get into the circle, and they wouldn't be allowed in. It just wouldn't, they wouldn't let them go. That's just, there's only so much room, and certain ones can't make it in. And I was with one of the naturalists, this woman. She was almost in tears one night. She goes, she goes, if I went over there right now, she goes, I could make it so that chick could get in, but we can't mess with nature. She goes, it would do nothing. She goes, I could go there right now, and it wouldn't affect anything. It would be fine. She goes, but we're not allowed to do that. So you knew that when you left certain days, the chicks that you saw on the outside of the circle wouldn't, they wouldn't be alive the next day, that was one part. And again, look, nature can be a very brutal thing. And that was part of it where you had to get used to that a little bit. So again, moving on though, the littlest chicks were just, they would pop, pardon?
Each pair has their own chick, right? So does that say something, is it one chick per pair?
No, in some cases it could be 3 or 4, It could be 1 or 2, it really varied. But what you did see, you saw family units. I'll tell you a story in a second that was remarkable, but they were distinctly traveling together. They would all huddle up, but then the families would break off. And you could tell there was a pecking order, there was a leader. There were certain penguins that were more dominant and more penguins followed them. They had a real caste system out there, which was really fascinating. And you would see things like this, where a mother would be tending to her chicks. That's my daughter photograph. Actually, this might be a video. But it gives you an idea of what the setting is like out there. It's very peaceful. The breezes were pretty good. There'll be more of those too. Okay, so on this day, I'm setting up my camera maybe my daughter's about where you are, and I'm over here. And I noticed something really weird. The family, 3 chicks and 2 adults, kind of walk literally right past me, and they go over to my daughter, and the adults leave. They're there for kind of a minute, and they leave the chicks with her. And I thought this was really incredible. They leave for about a half an hour. And for that half an hour, Claire sits there with her camera. They come up to her, they cuddle up to her, one pops in her camera bag, and they're all together. About a half hour later, the 2 adults come back from whatever it was they were doing. They circle back. It was like she'd been left to babysit them. And one of the naturalists saw that and was blown away by that. He said the fact that they would have trusted the chicks, that the chicks knew to stay with her, but they trusted them with her, it shows you that they're thinking out there. You know, the animals really, their instincts are interesting, but there is a thinking pattern. And Claire and I still talk about this, but what it's like to have these 3 chicks, you know, nuzzling up to her. One of them jumped in her lap. I mean, it was really, now again, she couldn't touch them. She couldn't engage, but she let them do whatever they wanted to do. And this was, I thought, one of the most incredibly sort of animated parts of this trip that really was really very profound, especially when the parents came back and collected them, and the 5 of them just scooted off to wherever they were going afterwards. At night, sometimes I like photographing sunsets as well, and I like astronomy. I like the stars. And what you notice down there, everything's in reverse. You know, you see constellations that are flipped and upside down. It's really, then you realize, oh yeah, I'm on the bottom. I'm not, you know, things are. But there were certain colors. They tell you there are colors up there that have no name. Certain kinds of pastel pinks and oranges and yellows that when they combine. I just thought this, we were at dinner one night down below, and I saw this light happening, and I'm like, I didn't have a jacket on, and I ran outside with my camera and just shot a whole series of these sunset images, which are always very beautiful. And again, always pointed to this idea of feeling like you're on another planet. Back on the helicopters the next day, these images, as you see chicks getting bigger out there, the ones that look right at you, the ones that just sort of throw their arms up in joy, I mean, you know, just create these incredibly cute moments. And then you would see what almost like a little conversations. You'd almost see birds that looked like they were getting in trouble. I know they probably weren't, but there were definite kind of disciplinarian sorts of things that appeared to be going on at certain parts, you know? And if a bird made too much noise, boom, mom was on it like that, you know? And it's again, very interesting patterns watching the families and the chicks, and certain families would kind of walk together, it looked like sometimes. These were days I'd look at my daughter sitting there and just think about where we were. And again, these are the moments I remember most fondly, just sort of the panorama, knowing that you were amongst about 30 or 35,000 of these animals out there in Antarctica, in an utterly pristine setting. Sometimes you'd see chicks gather alone, you know, especially as nightfall came. That's when it got like a little bit, a little dicey, because you knew they weren't all going to make it. You know, and you look at that. March of the Penguins. The March of the Penguins was filmed not far from where we were. They show you that on board, just to kind of put you in the mood of what's going on.
When you say they're not going to make it, do you mean that they're going to freeze to death, or that they're
yes.
going to get attacked by some kind of...
There's no predators out there. Nothing will get them where they are at this point. They won't be allowed in the huddle at night. They won't be able to get the warmth. And that's the hard part. That's really the hard part, because they're so fragile. And again, they tell you there'd be room. They just haven't figured out. They don't think there's room, but there is. But you can't go. You really can't mess with nature in that respect. One day I'm sitting there. This was my favorite moment. I'm lining up my tripod. It's about maybe this high, and I'm on my knee and I'm setting it up, and I sensed something weird over this shoulder. I thought it was my daughter. I thought she was going to ask me a question, and I turn, and it's an emperor penguin head. Now again, these birds are, in some cases, 4.5 feet tall, the adults. And literally, this head is right next to me. And I look, and our nose is almost hit, right? And I look, and I said, oh. And he kind of looks at me, and we're having this moment. And I remember the lady said, you know, you have a deep voice. So I didn't know what to talk about, but I was setting my lens up, so I figured, does it really matter? And I said, hey, I'm thinking of using, like, you know, this f-stop, and thinking of going with a 50 millimeter, what do you think of that? And it's sort of like, it starts nodding its head, and it's working, right? And then I ask it another question, shoot like this, and my light setting's not quite, and it's sort of, well then what they tell you is that certain adults might seem jealous if one of them's getting attention, right? And so a few seconds later, I notice the way this one's on my shoulder, there's another one now right here. And I turn, and he's like right in my face. So I'm like, all right, I'm explaining to your friend here about, the light setting. And now they're both kind of doing this thing. And my daughter's off to the side like, really? She's watching this. Well, then all of a sudden I look up, and I have my camera. I start quietly clicking. And these guys start to kind of surround me. This wall begins to happen, and they start marching closer toward me, right? And the chicks are sort of like, they're kind of getting swept along as well. And it started with him when he started marching over. I had these out of order. Then they start, and then the wall comes toward me. And they get within, I swear, about a foot and a half in front of me. And they all start making this racket. They all start, rah, rah, all of them, and little babies. And I'm just sitting there, and I'm clicking away. I get a little bit of video of it. And then after a minute or two of this, it stops. And they all turn around, and it's like they had their piece, they had their say, and then they just disappear. And again, you realize they kind of know what they're doing, but you don't. There's some system of communication they've got, and some sort of orchestrated reaction that they've got, but we just don't know what it is. But it's there, it's tangible. It's too specific what they do to be random. This was probably my favorite moment, having the two heads on either side, At one point, this guy actually rested his head on my parka. He just put it there, and I didn't move. And he just left it out there looking straight ahead. And they said, when they do it, they're just comfortable. They're just checking you out. We wear bright yellow parkas because they supposedly respond to yellow. But in most cases, we were the first people they'd ever seen, which is, again, something very, it feels like visiting another planet, like you're encountering this kind of new species. Like I said, I wasn't much of a penguin person before we left. Once I was there, I became completely plugged into what they were about and what they were like. This, again, just gives you an idea of what it's like when they start to and you see like other figures start to really, he would notice what was happening, and he would want to come check it out, and the chicks pick up on it. I mean, it's really amazing. I don't know why it's so jittery, but again, just to give you an idea of what it feels like, that's Claire sitting there. You can see on the ground certain chicks that didn't make it the night before. That's what those are.
Oh, man.
As I said, it's hard. It's hard.
So where's there must be fish, right?
They do. They do fish.
Close to the water.
I will tell you something. Well, I will tell you what we did. Penguins, they were so fascinated by our icebreaker. They would come, they found their way to our ship. And one thing the captain did, which again, he goes, we're not really supposed to do it. He started breaking holes in the ice just to open up seams so they could fish easier. That was one little thing they did to allow for that. He said the ice is especially thick this year. Let's give them a little bit of a hand, you know what I mean? But no, they're basically fishing in little pockets of water. That's what they're doing. They can swim, they can stay underwater for half an hour at a time. I mean, they're amazing swimmers, the adults. And so so once about 2 weeks, we're examining the emperor penguins. Then we get back on the ship, and the ship takes off for another part of Antarctica where we're going to be seeing Adelie penguins, different kind, smaller penguin. And on this particular night, this was a crazy night. It was after dinner, it was getting, the moon had come up, and there was a guy named Woody who was sort of like the crazy guide. He would go out, if you know what a Zodiac boat is, little inflatable boats. He would take the Zodiac out, but Woody was like great. He was he'd always push the envelope, and Claire and I were always up for that. So one night after dinner, he was Australian, he goes, come on, mate, we're three of us gonna go out. So,
Out on the ocean.
well, yeah, in the sea, in the Zodiac. So me and Claire and Woody go down, he gets the Zodiac out. again, it's probably 8 o'clock at night. 3 of us get in, and we're just kind of trolling around the waters very quietly. We turn a corner. We hear some noise. We turn a corner, and we see we're in the water. I've got a zoom lens here, and we see what looks like a cocktail party happening, all right? And it's the Adelie penguins on this piece of ice, and there's 5 or 6 of them, and they're making noise, and they're chattering and interacting, and it's just, we're just kind of like bobbing there watching it, and it's this really cool thing. Well, as it goes on, again, I just loved how this looked. Well, I don't have all the photos here, but as it went on, 3 of them bail on 2 of them, and it's 2 of them left, and they almost appear like they're having like it feels like an argument, and we're just there watching this. The only people in the world watching this, right? And as we're watching, I don't know how images I have. Anyway, what happens is, I'll explain it to you. I have about 12 images that tell the whole story, but these 3 leave. These 2 are complaining. Finally, she goes on top of this iceberg, this ice mountain, without him, right? She races away from him, and he's like trying to find her, and he goes up there, and now they're both on top there. And you can see it, it's framed against the moon. The sky is getting more and more orange. It's really stunning, just from an artistic standpoint, it's breathtaking. And they're having this, what looks like a lover's spat, at least what I project on it. And she finally does this dive off the berg down into the water and disappears. And he pauses for a second and then does the exact same thing and follows her down. It was just really kind of beautiful. And what he says, he goes like, "Aren't you glad we came out?" It's like those little things that you would miss. And then sometimes you'd see them swimming alongside the Zodiac, and I would shoot these images. Does anybody like taking pictures? Any other kind of photographer types here? What do you like to shoot?
Birds, well.
So you'd appreciate there's so many opportunities in terms of the birding and the penguins down there. It really, I just found it amazing. And again, we'd stop on little islands, and the gentoos and Adelies would kind of come up. They weren't as animated or interesting to me as the emperor penguins, but they're still penguins. To me, nothing really topped. The emperors, to me, were really the chance to kind of study them for a couple of weeks was something we'll never forget. Once we got home, as I said, Claire was writing for Time Magazine for Kids. She wrote a whole cover story about our trip. I think I wrote probably 7 articles for a whole variety of publications. But today, I mean, even today in the schools, her Time for Kids Antarctica story, they still use as a teaching device on Earth Day and to teach about animals and preservation and all that sort of thing. So Claire was always very proud that she got to do this. And being a Time for Kids reporter, she had a lot of cool adventures, but this was the one that I think really made us appreciate what she was doing. So that's kind of in a nutshell what our trip was. Thank you for hanging out today on Earth Day.